Welcome to Altered Cellular and Tissue Biology. I'm going to try to run through this really quickly because I only have 15 minutes. So we'll start with the father of modern pathology, Rudolf Virchow. He is German. He's both a physician and a chemist. And at the time, the concept of disease and physical cell or a disease and the disease process was all about like bile salts, right? And your humors and vapors. And he brought in the microscope and started looking at actual cellular changes. And he is the father of cellular pathology. And this is his little, all diseases are results from physical cell abnormalities. He is the very beginning of all of that concept, which is what we still hold true to this day. All right, by the time we're done, you're going to be able to describe 4 types of cellular injury and resulting manifestations, cellular degeneration and impact on the health of a person, and theories of cellular aging. And we're looking at adaptation first, right? So what can our cells do to avoid disease? Adapt. This is by drawing on our own reserves, and if we cannot, then you have issues that lead to cell death, typically. The adapted cell is not considered normal nor abnormal, right? It's just adapted. So we're going to start with the 4 types of cellular adaptation. Atrophy, which is this guy, where the cells are the same number, they're just decreased in size. Hypertrophy, where you have the same number, they're just each increased. And this is not fluid, right? This is cellular matrix and organelles that make up this hypertrophy of these cells. Hyperplasia is where you have an increase in the number of cells. And then metaplasia, now you have reversible replacement of one mature cell type by another cell type. Then dysplasia itself is precancerous. It's not a true adaptive change. You have deranged cellular growth, and this is the precursor to cancer. And you can see it's just all over the place. They're stacked. They're crazy. You got these gigantic nuclei, especially in comparison to the cytoplasm of the cell. Now we'll start with atrophy. This is a decrease in the cell size, right? And there's a lot of things that can cause atrophy. Disuse atrophy, like prolonged bed rest, you see when you take your cast off and you get that little shrivelly arm. Endocrine stimulation, like poor endocrine stimulation, alters or causes atrophy to the uterus in menopause. You'll also see this with like a physiological atrophy with the thymus gland as you get older, or you see it in infancy with the patent ductus arteriosus that atrophies. And it's a natural process, right? Because your body doesn't need to give energy to that, to those cells. And so they will adapt to make those cells smaller. They don't use as much energy. Brain atrophy also happens, like through ischemic events, with atherosclerotic changes to the carotid arteries, right? So you don't have the enough oxygen and nutrients going to the brain will atrophy over time. Starvation also leads to atrophy. Poor nutrients, right? The body will then use the proteins of the muscle to sustain itself. Hypertrophy. You go to the gym and your muscles actually become larger. The cells themselves, it's not that you have more cells, it's that each one individually is larger. And it's through that constant stimulus, the constant stress of working out, that they then adapt to become bigger. And they're full of, cellular proteins, endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria, the myofilaments, right? This isn't fluid. This is actually cellular content. Now, this only happens you'll see this in permanent tissues, like your skeletal muscles, your cardiac muscles, and your nerves cannot divide. So the only thing that they can do is become hypertrophic, right? Is become individually larger to adapt. And you'll see this like with your cardiac muscle, where the muscle itself will become hypertrophied, where it's larger because it has increased workload, so it needs to adapt. This is not always good, by the way. Hyperplasia is now you have actually more cells. It's not that each cell is larger, you have more cells. And it isn't uncommon, depending on the cells, to have both hyperplasia and hypertrophy. If the cells are non-dividing, like we were talking about with cardiac cells, then you only have hypertrophy instead. It is often driven by hormones and growth factor, right? Like your breast tissue, you have hypertrophy and hyperplasia in the breast tissue when you're pregnant or breastfeeding, right? And that is a part of adaptation, and it's hormonally driven. Hyperplasia, you got 3 different kinds: physiologic, pathologic, and compensatory. Breast and uterus with pregnancy, we were just talking about that. Pathological, endometrium enlarges and thickens because of excess estrogen production. So it's responding to the chemicals of its own body. And then compensatory, right? Chop out your liver, not all of it obviously, but it can regenerate, and it actually does it quickly. As long as it is not permanently damaged, right? Cirrhosis, you cannot have liver regeneration. But there is compensatory hyperplasia, that your body is now making more cells because it needs more cells. They either died or you cut them out and now it needs more. Now we're moving to metaplasia. This is reversible conversion of one adult type of cell to another adult type of cell. You will see this adaptation in Barrett's esophagus, right? Where you have that stimulus, the acid reflux, and so you'll have cellular changes to the epithelial cells of your esophagus. You'll also see this with smoking. I think I talked about it this past week. Smoking is that constant irritation, so the ciliated columnar epithelial cells that usually line your respiratory, the upper respiratory, will physically be replaced by stratified squamous, right? So that they are different cells to accommodate and to adapt to the constant irritation of smoking. And this is not particularly good because you need those cells to protect your airways and kind of move gunk up and out. So you're at increased risk of, bronchitis and infections and things like that because you don't have those same cells. Now it's reversible. So if you quit smoking, then 2 weeks into it, you will start to have different cells come back. They will adapt back because you no longer have that stressor. Dysplasia. So this is also called atypical hyperplasia. These are abnormal changes in size, shape, organization of mature cells, potentially reversible, but commonly leads to neoplastic changes, right? These are where really disoriented, disorganized, they are not on that basement membrane. Typically, they're all different sizes. The nuclei are super big, and it is dysfunctional adaptation. There you go. Well, technically it's not an adaptation. So another picture of the same ones. We're going to move into cellular injury, just because sake of time. So there's 4 biochemical themes for cellular injury, and we'll get into that in just a second. But when the cell is threatened, the cell reacts in one of 2 ways, right? You draw on its own reserve to keep functioning, or if it cannot, there's cellular death and necrosis. So we're going to look at toxic injury, infectious injury, physical injury, and then deficit injury. Hypoxia being the number one deficit injury, and the number one injury of cells is that lack of oxygen. We're going to start off talking about free radicals. Now they have an unpaired electron, so they are highly reactive to everything, all things, right? No class of molecules is immune. Chemical injuries during for any purpose can be catastrophic depending. And so you'll have a lot of different chemicals that you may not even know about or have known about. And we're kind of constantly finding these things out, actually. So lead is a common one. We look at it through the blood because you can't detect it easily. You'll find it in old blown glass and in the soil and in older paints in those old homes, and it causes chronic problems as children grow up, right? It acts like iron in the body, binds with oxygen, and so then you'll have anemia because it isn't iron, it's lead. And you'll tend to have mental disturbances, like they will have neurobehavioral, intellectual performance problems, and so it's very important to identify this early on. Carbon monoxide, also deadly. These are the stories you hear about somebody with the kerosene heater and they go to sleep and then everyone dies in the house. Carbon monoxide, you can't smell it. They added gas to our natural gas, or they added smell to our natural gas so that you could smell if there was a natural gas leak, because the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. Typically that first sign is headache, but you may not even know. It has an incredibly high affinity for hemoglobin. And so what happens is the carbon monoxide itself binds with hemoglobin, and then it takes all those hemoglobin sites up, so oxygen can't bind to anything. So if I take somebody who is carbon monoxide poisoning and I throw on 100% FiO2 on oxygen on them, it's not going to help at all because I put it in their lungs, but it cannot bind to anything in the blood. You actually have to chelate it off of the hemoglobin through the blood and then free up those hemoglobin sites for oxygen to bind to. It's very deadly. Other toxins, alcohol, right, causes vitamin B, phosphorus, mag deficiencies, addition to liver damage and stomach. Mercury, you find this in fish and fillings, in the old school, what are those, thermometers, and it worsens those degenerative diseases and impacts the brain itself. Fetal alcohol syndrome impacts the development of babes as well. So on children, you'll see those low-set ears, close-set eyes. They'll be missing that philtrum there and flattened nasolabial folds as a telltale sign, and they typically come with slowed mental capacities too. Infectious injury. This is injury to the cell integrity because of toxins and outside agents that then cause reactions to the cell. Viral, fungal, protozoan, bacterial agents, right? We're always at risk for infectious injury. Physical injury is exactly what it sounds like. You're actually physically injuring the cell or the intracellular organelles. So you've got two major types, thermal or mechanical, and it's not just that they exist, it's also the dose, right? So think about the sun. You can go out in the sun and it doesn't cause physical injury, but if you have a large dose or you're exposure to the sun, you then now have cellular injury because of that dose reaction. Mechanical, this is literally motor vehicle accidents, frostbite, ischemia, right? That you're physically injuring the cell. Hypoxic injury is the number one, the biggest cause for cellular injury. Decreasing oxygen to your cells causes cellular injury and cellular death pretty quickly. Looking at heart attack wise, right? 1 minute after the blood supply stops to that section of the heart becomes pale, can't contract. 3 to 5 minutes, that ischemic portion is not contracting at all because you don't have ATP. Then your sodium potassium pump fails and they swell, and then it becomes irreversible damage. Here, look at these guys on your PowerPoints because we're running out of time. But your normal, healthy, functioning cell, you've got that sodium-potassium pump, and it kicks out 3 sodium ions from intracellular environment and pumps in 2 potassium ions. And that's how it works. And it maintains the osmotic relationship, and it maintains the, the action potential of the cell itself. Hydropic degeneration is when you have injury. This is actually a really good, on the left-hand side, is really good kind of throughput of hydropic degeneration. Injury, that hypoxia, ATP production decreases. This is the energy of the cell. Sodium and water move into the cell, and then potassium moves out of the cell. And so then you have osmotic pressure increase, so more water comes into the cell, it's getting larger and larger, and then you have extensive vacuolation. And so that's where this is kind of the step-by-step of hydropic degeneration, which causes permanent damage to the cell because eventually it will lyse. Deficit injury, you need all of these things: water, oxygen, nutrients, lack of maintenance of temperature, and adequate waste. If you have one of them gone, right, it causes disruption or death. Now we're leading to our cellular disruption and death, right? Necrosis. This is the death of the cell. And you've got gangrenous necrosis, which there's a couple different ways. So check this out. The dry gangrene, it sounds exactly like you would think. Coagulative necrosis, skin is dry, it shrinks, it wrinkles, and it becomes dark and black. You have wet gangrene, where neutrophils invade, and it causes liquefaction, and all of the tissue around it becomes progressively more necrotic. And then gas gangrene, which is really fast acting. Typically, it's caused by several species of Clostridium, and it is catastrophic. It destroys connective tissue. It liquefies the muscle itself, all tissue, bubbles of gas that form in the muscle, and it is very stinky and deadly. Gangrene of the toes. Apoptosis is amazing. You better know this word. This is programmed cell death. And our cells are always building themselves up. They're dying and building up all the time. 10 billion new cells every single day. So we are always replacing our own cells. We're going to end with cellular aging. Aging is normal. Lost cell structure decreases in size with atrophy, or aging may be due to random injuries and events, so normal wear and tear, and that these would be our cellular aging theories. Now, at the very end, I've got NCLEX questions. Go ahead and look through them. I think I have 4, and see how you do, and we can talk about them in class. Thanks.